my hope. It has to be spread out, the skin of this planet. I don't know if anybody recognizes that line. It's Neruda. And I was wanting to do Neruda, and as I was looking at a poem that I was translating, it came to me that P.K. Page had died recently, and that's probably her most famous glossa, so I was going to read that at the end of it. But I thought I'd just share with you a little of my experience of P.K. Page, Patricia Kathleen Page. She came from England in 1916 and moved to Red Deer, Alberta, and then grew up in Calgary. And as a young woman went off to New Brunswick, and that was in the 30s, so you can imagine that time. And actually what I'm reading from here is her own beautiful memoir in verse called Hand Luggage. So they're just some snippets of her own voice, which truly, this extraordinary woman, she lived until she was 93. She ended her life in Victoria, and she was one of Canada's institutions in a way, and so delightful in her approach to poetry and life. And so she writes about being out in the Maritimes. There I grew up as a debutante, dated, drank rum and coke from a teapot at dances, those temperance days in the Kennebeckasis. Why didn't we drown as we dived, full of gin? I suppose drunkard's luck. She has a very good sense of humor. Easygoing, fun-loving, I tried to fit in among embryo bankers and lawyers, the rich. Almost made it, but always the hunger for art interfered with romance. I was bored by their chat, so I acted in amateur theater and wrote, found potters and painters and poets, preferred my typewriter to any boyfriend. Askance was the glance of my parents, a goose, not a swan, from a duck egg. Dear birds of the air, what goes on? She moved from New Brunswick to Montreal, and that time in Montreal's poetic history was rich, rich. Now here's this extraordinary woman, P.K. Page. I mean, for me, she's just up there. But listen to what she says about being in Montreal. Montreal, the 40s, Calèche, the snow as high as a house, grey stone, the French, and a room of one's own, lapsang souchong for tea, alone but not lonely, my typewriter, me, and I wrote, a real writer, or such was my wish. Is it luck? Is it destiny? How to account for the fact, knowing nobody, I could connect, a kid from the sticks, with Abe Klein and Frank Scott, Arthur Smith, Patrick Anderson, Preview, the lot, a miracle, more than a miracle now. Looking back through the years, though I'm sure even then, it must have felt strange. I was out of my depth, but somehow they seemed to accept what I wrote, and wonder of wonders, my views on their work. So she goes on in this memoir to describe what it was like to go to these people, and during temperance as well, what they drank, how they found it, what they did. And she writes, I mean, I'm not sure where I remember hearing this, either from a friend or what. She was desperate. This was her goal, was to be published in poetry, our very own poetry that we hand out. And she managed to get published in poetry. Finally, there she is. I was published by poetry, wrote at a pace I could envy today, and I do. Now, 60 years later, the last of the herd. And of course, indeed, when she was writing this, she was the last of the herd. I look back on a jam-packed and passionate life. I was writing, in love, had a job, and good friends. Oscar Peterson played at a dive down the street. I know. It's just vivid. Now, she married a wonderful man in 1950, so she married in her middle years. And they went off to diplomatic posts all over the world, and she stopped writing for a long time. It just dried up. She said one of the reasons was that she didn't hear English, and somehow she lost her ability to write. But she became a painter, and she writes about painting. And she's actually quite a well-known painter. Her paintings are in the National Art Gallery. She wrote under her married name, P.K. Irwin. So beautiful stuff. And when they came back, she started writing. They came back in the 60s. She describes coming back, saying, "Homecoming was hard. I'd forgotten how cold Canadians seem. I was Latin by then, and demonstrative ways were not welcomed by friends from my earlier days. I felt foreign at home. All the warmth I had learned, I must unlearn again." And with time, she gets back into writing, though she really professionally had a slow start. And I'll just describe her description of a little bit of what happened. And so she says, this is her own view of herself. "In a world of confessional verse, what I wrote was not à la mode, not exactly old hat, nor was it post-mortem. I didn't quite fit. But I wrote this and that, a memoir of Brazil, children's books, a short story, apocryphal, that Joy Coghill performed as a one-woman show with Cram." That's Robert Cram, the flute player from Ottawa. "My collected came out, what an editor, Stan, what a bookmaker, Tim. Then I found a new form, and inspired at full speed, wrote a full book of glosses, the book Hologram." And I thought, just to finish, I'd read this, one of her famous, she found a way of writing. She wrote in many different forms, but she was known as a form poet, a huge respecter of form, and she writes lovingly about form as a way of creating language for yourself and a sense of poetry and tension in language. But this one, of course, is the most famous of all of them. It's called Planet Earth. Do you know it? It's so beautiful. It was chosen in 2001 to be part of a United Nations program to foster dialogue among nations. Our own P.K. Page, involving readings around the country, around the world, to try to bring a real sense of love back to the planet, a love back to our appreciation of Earth. So here's a poet writing, and she starts off with 4 lines from Pablo Neruda's In the Praise of Ironing. "It has to be spread out, this skin of the planet. It has to be ironed, the sea in its whiteness, and the hands keep on moving, smoothing the holy surfaces. It has to be loved the way a laundress loves her linens, the way she moves her hands caressing the fine muslins, knowing their warp and woof like a lover coaxing or a mother praising. It has to be loved as if it were embroidered with flowers and birds and 2 joined hearts upon it. It has to be stretched and stroked. It has to be celebrated. Oh, this great beloved world and all the creatures in it. It has to be spread out, the skin of this planet. The trees must be washed, and the grasses and mosses, they have to be polished as if made of green brass. The rivers and little streams with their hidden cresses and pale colored pebbles, then their fool's gold, must be watched and starched or shined into brightness, the sheets of lake water, smoothed with the hand and the foam of the oceans pressed into neatness. It has to be ironed, the sea in its whiteness, and pleated and goffered, the blue flower sea, the protean wine-dark gray-green sea, with its meters of satin and bolts of brocade, and skies such an overhead, night and day, must be burnished and rubbed by hands that are loving, so the blue blazons forth, and the stars keep on shining within and above, and the hands keep on moving. It has to be made bright, the skin of this planet, till it shines in the sun like gold leaf. Archangels then will attend to its metals and polish the rods of its rain. Seraphim will stop singing hosannas to shower it with blessings and blisses and praises. And newly in love we must draw it and paint it, our pencils and brushes and loving caresses, smoothing the holy surfaces. And before she died, She was nominated as a finalist for the Griffin 2010 Poetry Prize. They didn't choose her. She died in January 2010. PK Page. Thank you.